8 years ago, on August 29, 2005, a Category 3 tropical cyclone made landfall in Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana. This storm had previously been designated Katrina, according to the National Weather Service's arbitrary, sequential, alphabetical naming system. Now the name Katrina is infamous. It was one of the most physically destructive storms in U.S. history and the 6th strongest Atlantic hurricane on record. Now, we've had a ton of hurricanes in our recorded weather history, but the problem with Katrina was the human devastation that resulted from it. After many investigations, we know now that pretty much every single aspect of emergency management was botched before, during, and after Katrina. From incorrect storm movement predictions to delayed evacuation orders to disorganized evacuation routes and general lack of urgency among officials and residents. And of course, probably the biggest catastrophe was the levees. Good Lord, the breached levees. Those of you in my class know that it is a constant battle to keep water at bay in New Orleans. Why? It's under sea level, right? So the city resides under sea level during normal circumstances, let alone when the water level increases by 8, 12, 18, 24 inches. There's just no way to keep it under control. So there's these catastrophic events related to emergency management, but on the other side of the spectrum, one of the most egregious occurrences related to Hurricane Katrina was the use of intensely racist rhetoric and behavior by onlookers, politicians, and the media throughout coverage of the storm. In the days and weeks following the storm, Black residents of the city of New Orleans were labeled as looters, vagrants, rapists, criminals, and a host of other derogatory terms. We saw displaced residents in the city subjected to internment-like conditions in the Superdome with dangerous criminal situations happening. There's a lack of food, water, electricity, waste disposal. Unarmed citizens had guns pointed at them and fired upon them when they were trying to escape the rising floodwater and get out of the city. Mobs of young men were portrayed as vandals wandering around the city. Survivors were arrested for theft even when they were simply stealing basic means of survival. We saw families after families waiting on their rooftops for somebody to come help them. And these people that stayed behind, some of them met the worst possible fate, and we saw dead bodies over and over again. Overwhelmingly, throughout the entire crisis, the face of chaos and tragedy in the city of New Orleans was black. Now, these inflammatory and racist reports about the story served a few different functions. They functioned to criminalize and blame the victims of the storm rather than looking at a well-established, deep-rooted history of racism and inequality that existed in the city of New Orleans. If you look at the structural and infrastructural inequalities in New Orleans, we can see a pronounced history of discrimination in settlement patterns, public works projects, transportation resources, and natural resource management. This deep-rooted inequality affected who felt the impact of Katrina, how severe they felt those impacts, and why predominantly we saw the face of African Americans suffering throughout the storm. So, what does all this mean? New Orleans has an overwhelmingly African American population. Why do you think that is?
Slave trade?
Yeah, it's the remnants of slavery. Just looking at this, we can see that the population distribution in the United States is a reflection of the lasting remnants of slavery. New Orleans as a city blossomed because it's at the mouth of the Mississippi River, right? And it ultimately became a location for slave trade throughout the 1700s and 1800s. Because of that, the city is highly segregated. patterns of settlement in the city of New Orleans developed during a time when racial discrimination was the norm. So it should come as no surprise that when we look at the geographic layout of New Orleans, the higher ground is populated by wealthy white neighborhoods such as Uptown, the White Teapot, whereas neighborhoods that are under sea level include Dillard, the 7th Ward, and the 9th Ward. Now, if we look at this map of the racial demographics of the city of New Orleans, and let's compare it to the sea level in the city of New Orleans, pay attention to the curve in the river. See the curve in the river? Higher ground is labeled in orange. So the wealthiest white neighborhood right here is in orange. This is all artificially higher, by the way, because obviously the river would be the lowest part. Whereas where I pointed out the 9th Ward and the 7th Ward are in these lower portions. Now let's look at where it flooded during New Orleans, or during Katrina rather. It flooded right in this basin here, as well as in those neighborhoods that are more overwhelmingly African American. And to give you just a more, even a closer idea of it. So there's the racial distribution. Here's the flood map. It's pretty much a direct correlation. And we do see that there's one wealthy white neighborhood up here, Lakeview, that floods, and that's simply because the levee breaks, because the levees were in terrible condition. Okay, so after the storm, everybody started saying, these people are so stupid. Why do they live in these neighborhoods? New Orleans is underwater. They need to move out of there. African Americans didn't choose to live in the 9th Ward. It was simply where they were allowed to live when settlement patterns developed. And black families in 2005 had generations of roots in these areas. And it's not acceptable to just say to somebody, well, you're wrong for living there. You need to move out of it. I think most of us would agree that you can't just tell somebody they need to leave their home and family where they've been for generations. Say, for example, what if I said, as an environmental historian, I have decided that there is no water in West Texas. And it is environmentally stupid to live here. So everybody that lives in West Texas needs to move. How's that going to work out?
Yeah, let's go.
No, of course not. I think the mentality in Texas would be, yeah, you can have my land and deprived from my cold dead hands, right?
Yeah.
So it's not fair to ask people to leave their homes and families. In fact, it's unfair and simply impossible to ask anyone, let alone vulnerable, impoverished populations, to just move up and leave and settle someplace else. Okay, what's the point of all this? While the federal government and news media tried very, very hard to blame the storm and blame the victims for all of these problems that occurred in relation to Katrina, in fact, the hurricane didn't cause any of this. It simply illuminated and exacerbated a pre-existing set of problems. The events that occurred in connection with Katrina are not a new phenomenon. The idea that populations of color and low-income populations suffer unduly disproportionate environmental consequences is a field of study known as environmental justice. So, the EPA recognized environmental justice in 1994, and the current definition of it is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, enforcement of environmental regulations, laws, policies, etc. Environmental justice will be achieved when everyone enjoys the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards and equal access to the decision-making process to have a healthy environment in which to live, learn, and work. Sounds reasonable. It's very, very hard to achieve, though. The reason that there was a need to have this definition in this field of study is that historically, low-income and minority populations have a more difficult time being politically represented. It's more difficult to have political influence if you don't have money to back it up. It sounds cynical, but unfortunately that's the case. So as a result, low-income populations have been less able to resist negative environmental consequences such as the location of toxic waste sites and dams and landfills and dumps and all of those sorts of things. And basically because these groups are not well represented, those that have been historically in charge of decision making get to decide where these things are located, and the attitude is sort of like, well, I don't care if it affects that community over there as long as it's not in my backyard, right? NIMBY, not in my backyard. So it's sort of a mentality that it doesn't matter as long as it doesn't affect me. Now, what I'm going to talk about now is how there are tons of historical examples of environmental injustice, but it wasn't until the early 1980s that this problem was articulated and became part of activism and legislation. So why did it take so long for this to be a recognized problem?